The tires of my old Ford crunched over the gravel as I pulled up to the final destination of my self-imposed exile, a quaint, if somewhat decrepit, cottage in the far reaches of rural Maine. It was supposed to be my sanctuary, a place to escape the clamor of city life and the relentless pressure of deadlines. The ad promised peace, quiet, and most importantly, isolation. Perfect conditions for a writer with a looming deadline and a severe case of writer's block. As I stepped out of the car, the chill of the early fall air wrapped around me like a cold embrace. The silence was immediate and overwhelming, punctuated only by the distant calls of birds and the rustling of leaves. The cottage itself looked like it had leapt straight out of a postcard for quaint rustic living. Its wooden facade was weathered to a soft gray, with ivy creeping up one side as if trying to claim the building back from human hands. I retrieved my bags and made my way to the front door, the keys jangling nervously in my hand. The door creaked ominously as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through what I assumed would be my writing haven for the next several months. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and old wood, the kind of smell that spoke of long winters and the quiet solitude of a life lived far from the hustle and bustle of modern society. As I wandered through the small, dimly lit rooms, I noticed the sparse, outdated furniture that seemed to hold the echoes of countless previous occupants. It wasn't just the isolation of the geographical location that struck me, it was the isolation one felt from time itself, as if the house and everything within it had been forgotten by the world outside. I decided to take a walk before sunset, hoping to familiarize myself with the surroundings and stretch my legs after the long drive. The village, if it could even be called that, consisted of a few scattered houses similar in design to my temporary home, each spaced generously apart to ensure that each inhabitant could enjoy their solitude without intrusion. The locals, I noticed, were few and far between, each nodding or waving with a kind of reserved friendliness as I passed by. Their faces were weathered, much like the landscape, carved from living a life so close to nature. It was during this walk that I first saw them children, or so they seemed from a distance. There were 3 of them, playing near the edge of the woods that bordered the village. Their laughter was the only sound that seemed to fill the air, yet as I approached, I felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Their games stopped abruptly, and they turned to look at me, their eyes piercingly intense for one so young. Something about their gazes felt unsettling, as if they knew more about why I was here than I did myself. Shaking off the uneasy feeling, I smiled and waved, receiving no response as they simply turned back to their mysterious games. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the land, I turned back towards the cottage. The image of the children lingered in my mind, their silent stares and eerie presence coloring my thoughts. Back inside, the house seemed even quieter than before, each room cloaked in the soft, gray twilight. I set about unpacking my things, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. Tonight, I would begin my work, I decided. Tonight, I would try to forget the strange isolation and the even stranger children of the secluded village. But as night fell and the darkness deepened, I found myself listening intently for the sound of laughter in the wind, wondering if I had imagined it all. As the darkness settled in, I made my way to the small kitchen to prepare some dinner. The house, with its creaking floorboards and whispering walls, seemed to watch me as I moved from room to room. Every sound I made echoed back at me, as if the house itself was learning the sound of my presence. Dinner was a simple affair: soup from a can, heated over the old gas stove, and a slice of bread that was a bit stiffer than I liked. After eating, I set up my writing space in what appeared to have been used as a study by one of the previous occupants. An ancient desk sat in front of a window that offered a view of the deepening shadows of the woods beyond. The laptop seemed oddly modern against the backdrop of peeling wallpaper and an ornate oil lamp that I had found in a cupboard and lit to ward off the growing gloom. I tried to focus on the screen, on the blinking cursor that awaited the flood of words I hoped would come. But my thoughts kept drifting back to the children. There was something profoundly disturbing about them, something uncannily knowing in their stares. The silence of the house pressed down on me, heavy with expectation. With a sigh, I closed my laptop and decided to explore the rest of the house, hoping to clear my mind. The upstairs was comprised of 2 bedrooms and a small bathroom, all furnished with items that seemed as old as the house itself. The master bedroom, where I had left my bags, had a large, old-fashioned bed with a wrought iron frame and a mattress that felt like it was stuffed with straw. The second bedroom was smaller, dustier, and had a strange, almost palpable chill to it. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper featuring scenes of pastoral bliss, so at odds with the feeling of isolation outside. It was then, in the quiet and the solitude of that room, that I heard a soft giggle, floating up from the darkness outside. Goosebumps prickled along my skin as I moved slowly to the window, peering out into the night. The moon was a thin crescent, barely casting enough light to illuminate the garden below, yet there was no sign of anyone out there. I told myself it was just the wind, or a stray animal, perhaps the nocturnal call of a bird that I was unaccustomed to. But the laughter had sounded unmistakably human. I retreated from the window, suddenly eager to be away from the eerie chill of that small room. Back downstairs, I made a small fire in the living room hearth, hoping its crackle and warmth would dispel the last remnants of unease. But as I settled into an old, creaky armchair with a book, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone, that the eyes of the village, of the house, and perhaps those children, were still on me. Eventually, I climbed into bed, the fire downstairs reduced to embers, casting faint, dancing shadows on the walls. As I drifted towards sleep, the edges of my consciousness blurred, and I thought I heard it again, that soft, chilling giggle, like a whisper in the dark, seeping through the cracks of the house. Was it real, or just the product of my overactive imagination? I resolved to find out more about these children in the morning. For now, all I could do was pull the blankets closer and tell myself that it was just the isolation, just the unfamiliarity of this place playing tricks on my mind. As sleep finally claimed me, I hoped for a dreamless night. But somewhere deep inside, I knew better. The morning brought a dense, white fog that settled over the village like a shroud. The air was chilly and damp, and as I made my way downstairs, the echoes of last night's unsettling giggles still hung heavily in my mind. The thought of facing the blank page of my novel was daunting, but the mystery of the children drew me even more. I decided to start my day with a walk, hoping to clear my head and, perhaps foolishly, to catch another glimpse of the mysterious children from the night before. I stepped outside, the fog swallowing the world beyond a few feet. The village was eerily silent, even the usual morning sounds seemed muted by the dense mist. As I walked towards the woods, the outlines of houses faded into ghostly shapes, and the path under my feet became less defined, more a memory than a visible trail. As I approached the edge of the woods where I had seen the children playing yesterday, a sense of unease crept up my spine. The fog made the trees look like specters, their branches reaching out like the fingers of ghosts. I stopped, listening, but there was nothing, only the soft whisper of the fog moving through the trees. Then, out of the silence, came the sound of laughter, clear, distinct, and unmistakably childlike. It floated through the fog, surreal and disembodied. I followed the sound, my heart pounding, not sure what I would find or whether I wanted to find anything at all. The laughter led me deeper into the woods, the ground beneath my feet soft and uneven with fallen leaves. Suddenly, the shapes of 3 children materialized in the fog ahead of me. They were playing hopscotch on an old, worn path, their movements slow and deliberate, almost ritualistic. As I approached, they stopped and turned to look at me, their eyes piercing through the fog with an intensity that made me stop in my tracks. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding loud in the silence that followed their ceased laughter. They didn't respond, just continued to stare. One of them, a girl with long, dark hair and an old-fashioned dress, tilted her head slightly, as if considering me. "Are you from the village?" I asked, taking a cautious step forward. The girl nodded slowly, and then, as if deciding I was harmless, turned and resumed her game. The other 2 followed suit, ignoring me now that I was no longer a novelty. I watched them for a few moments, mystified by their calm acceptance of the fog, their isolation, and their outdated clothes that looked like they'd been taken out of a century-old photograph. It was as if they were playing a game from another time, untouched by the modern world. Curiosity overcame my unease, and I asked, "Why are you playing out here all alone? Where are your parents?" The girl stopped again and looked at me. Her expression was solemn, far too serious for a child. "We play where we like," she said, her voice melodic but chilling. "And we're never alone." The ambiguity of her answer sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to ask more, to understand what she meant, but the sound of a branch snapping in the distance startled me, breaking the spell. When I looked back, the children were gone, as if they had dissolved into the fog. I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened. The isolation of the place, the fog, and the children's eerie presence intertwined, creating a tape of strange and unsettling feelings. I knew then that this wasn't just a simple retreat for writing. There was something more to this village, something mysterious and possibly sinister. With more questions than answers, I headed back to the cottage, the fog slowly lifting but the weight of the morning's encounter lingering heavily. The rest of the day was spent in front of my laptop, but the words on the screen often blurred into thoughts of the children in the fog. Who were they really? And what did they mean by never being alone? The days began to blur, one into the next, as I found myself drawn deeper into the mysteries surrounding the village and its spectral children. The morning after my fog-laden encounter, I awoke with a palpable sense of purpose. Today, I would seek answers. If the village held secrets, then surely someone among its tight-knit residents could shine a light on the shadowy whispers that seemed to echo just beneath the surface. I ventured out, the air crisp and clear, a stark contrast to yesterday's veiling mist. My first stop was the village's only cafe, a modest establishment that served as a communal hub. It was there I hoped to glean some insight into the history of the place and perhaps more about the children I couldn't seem to escape. The cafe was quaint, the smell of fresh coffee and pastries a warm welcome as I entered. The walls were adorned with historical photographs of the village, including several faded images of what appeared to be the old schoolhouse. Noticing my interest, the cafe owner, a kindly woman named Mrs. Elwood, approached. "First time seeing our little museum, eh?" she remarked with a gentle smile. "Yes, I'm quite intrigued by the history of this place," I confessed, gesturing towards the photographs. "Oh, we've got plenty of that. Care for some coffee while you take in the sights?" Gratefully accepting, I soon found myself seated at a small table, a steaming cup in hand, as Mrs. Elwood joined me, her eyes reflecting the pride of a lifelong resident. "You seem particularly taken by the old schoolhouse pictures," she noted. "Yes, I've heard some stories," I began cautiously, "about children playing in the woods, even in the fog." A shadow flickered across her face, a subtle hardening of her features. "Ah, those stories. They've been around for as long as I can remember. Tragic, really." "Tragic? How so?" I prodded gently, sensing the delicate nature of the topic. Mrs. Elwood sighed, her voice dropping to a whisper as if the very walls might overhear. "Years ago, long before you or even your parents might have been born, there was a terrible fire. The schoolhouse caught ablaze one autumn night. Several children, they didn't make it out." The room seemed to grow colder with her words, the gravity of the past settling around us like a shroud. "And these children," I ventured, "their spirits, aren't they what people see in the woods?" "It's what some say," she admitted, her eyes darting around the room before settling back on me. "Folks here don't talk about it much. It's a painful memory for the village. But sometimes, the past doesn't want to be forgotten." Thanking Mrs. Elwood, I left the cafe with a heavy heart and a mind swirling with thoughts. The day was waning as I made my way towards the local library, driven by a newfound need to uncover more. The librarian, a meticulous man named Mr. Harrow, was more than willing to assist when I mentioned my interest in the village's history. Together, we combed through old newspapers, books, and town records. The story I pieced together was heart-wrenching: a night of horror, children trapped by flames, a community forever scarred. Yet, the accounts were clinical, almost detached. None could convey the palpable sense of unresolved sorrow that Mrs. Elwood's story hinted at. As I read, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the library's tall windows. Mr. Harrow noted my intense focus and offered a final piece of the puzzle. "There's a diary here from one of the teachers who survived the fire. Not many know of it," he whispered, pulling a small, charred book from a locked cabinet. "Maybe this will give you what you're looking for." The diary was fragile, its pages yellowed and brittle. I handled it carefully, turning to the entries just before and after the tragic fire. The words were filled with grief and guilt, the teacher's hand growing more erratic as she described the night of the fire and the days following. She wrote of the children's screams, her efforts to save them, and her deep despair at failing so many. But it was the final entry that caught my breath. "They visit me," it read. "In the night, in the fog. They're lost, and they blame me. I hear their whispers. I see their shadows. And I know they will never rest, nor will I." Closing the diary, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The children's laughter echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of the past's persistent grip. As I left the library, the echo of my own footsteps seemed to mingle with whispers of the long-deceased, and I knew that understanding their plight was perhaps the key to their release and my own. After delving into the tragic history of the village and the haunting accounts from the past, my nights became restless, filled with dreams of fire, smoke, and the echoing cries of children. The days were no easier. My thoughts were continually drawn back to the eerie, unresolved sorrow that seemed to permeate the air around the old cottage and the woods. I knew I could not ignore the pull of this mystery. Something compelled me to understand and, hopefully, to help. On a particularly gray morning, fueled by a mix of dread and determination, I decided to explore the attic of the cottage. It was the one place I hadn't yet searched thoroughly, perhaps because part of me feared what I might find. With each step up the creaking ladder, the air grew colder, dust motes dancing in the weak light that filtered through a small window. The attic was cramped and filled with boxes and old furniture covered in white sheets, which gave them the appearance of ghosts lurking in the dimness. I began to sift through the boxes, finding mostly old bills, newspapers, and some photographs of people who must have once called this place home. But it was a small, locked trunk that caught my attention, pushed into a dark corner as if forgotten or purposely hidden. I managed to break the lock with some effort and lifted the lid. Inside, there were several items, a few books, more photographs, and at the bottom, a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. I settled myself on the floor, the trunk before me, and began to read. The letters were from a woman named Eliza, written to her sister. They dated back to around the time of the schoolhouse fire. As I read, Eliza's words painted a vivid picture of the village in the aftermath of the tragedy. She spoke of the overwhelming grief that gripped the community, the funerals that were too many to bear, and of her own deep sadness and fear. But it was her final few letters that chilled me to the bone. Eliza wrote of seeing the children, not just in her dreams, but wandering around the village at dusk, playing near the woods, or staring into the windows of the houses. She believed they were unable to move on, held back by some unresolved anguish or perhaps anger at their untimely deaths. Her aisle, my footsteps echoing softly. At the altar, I found the vicar, an elderly man named Father O'Hara, arranging some books. He looked up as I approached, his face etching into lines of curiosity. "Good afternoon, Father," I began, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet of the church. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but I'm researching the history of the village, particularly the events surrounding the old schoolhouse fire." Father O'Hara's expression changed, a flicker of recognition, or was it apprehension, crossing his features. "Ah, a tragic chapter in our history," he replied, his voice tinged with a somber note. "What is it that you seek, my child?" I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal of my experiences. I believe that the children who perished might still be present, in some form. I've encountered them, or at least, I think I have. I need to understand why they can't find peace. The vicar studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. "The bonds that tie spirits to this world are often forged from unresolved anguish. Come with me," he said, leading me to a small room that served as the church's archives. We spent hours poring over old parish registers, baptismal records, and funeral rites, tracing the lives and untimely deaths of the children. Father O'Hara shared stories passed down through generations, tales of sorrow and loss that had imbued the village with a profound sense of mourning. As night approached, he turned to a small, locked cabinet and withdrew a key from his pocket. "There is something else," he said, his voice low. Opening the cabinet, he took out an ancient-looking book bound in faded leather. "This is the journal of Father Malley, the vicar at the time of the fire." He wrote of the fire, the children, and his own efforts to help them pass on. The journal was filled with meticulous entries, Father Malley's handwriting a flowing script that spoke of a bygone era. His words revealed a deep empathy for his parishioners and a tormenting guilt over his perceived failure to save the children. As I read, one entry caught my attention. "They come to me in dreams, their voices plaintive, their eyes beseeching. They do not understand their fate, nor why they remain tethered to the mortal realm. I have prayed, conducted rites, yet the veil remains unlifted. I fear they are bound by something unspoken, a secret that died with them." Chilled, I looked up at Father O'Hara. What secret could he have meant? The vicar sighed, closing the journal softly. "Sometimes, the veil between past and present is pierced by truth. These children, their lives were cut short so abruptly, perhaps their spirits were left, confused, unable to grasp their tragic end. They need understanding, recognition of their plight, perhaps even absolution." As we left the archives, the church was bathed in the glow of moonlight, the stained glass windows dark and watchful. "What should I do?" I asked, more to myself than to Father O'Hara. "Listen to them," he replied, his voice echoing slightly in the stillness of the church. "Help them understand, help them be heard. Only then might they find the peace they seek." That night, back at the cottage, the air seemed charged with a silent expectancy. I lit a fire, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows across the room. Settling into an armchair with Father Malley's journal, I readied myself for a night of revelations, hoping to finally understand the voices of the past, to give them the peace they so desperately needed. As the wind howled outside, I felt the thin veil between the present and the past lift slightly, the whispers of the children growing louder, their stories ready to be heard. As the end of October approached, the village began to prepare for its annual commemoration of the tragic schoolhouse fire. This solemn event, I learned, was not only a time of remembrance but also served as a collective catharsis for the community, a way to honor the young souls lost so many years ago. With my newfound understanding of the children's restless spirits, this year's commemoration felt particularly poignant and charged with an urgent sense of purpose. The morning air was crisp as I walked through the village, noticing the subtle changes that had come with the preparation for the event. Orange and red leaves decorated the streets, swept into neat piles by the chilly autumn winds. Posters announcing the commemoration were displayed in shop windows, and somber decorations adorned the village square. I stopped by the cafe where Mrs. Elwood was arranging a small display of candles and old photographs, including some of the school before the fire. Seeing me, she waved me over with a sad smile. "It's a special time for us," she explained as I helped her hang a garland of autumn leaves. "It's when we feel closest to those we've lost, as if they're right here with us, sharing our grief and perhaps finding their own peace." Her words resonated with me, echoing the task I felt had been placed upon my shoulders to bridge the gap between the living and the spirits of the children. "Mrs. Elwood, do you think the village would be open to someone new, like me, participating in the ceremony?" "Oh, dear," she replied, her eyes softening, "I think it would be a kind thing. You've taken such an interest in our history, and this might be a way for you to connect even deeper. You might even find some peace of your own." Encouraged by her words, I spent the next few days immersing myself further into the community's life. I visited families, listened to their stories of past and present, and shared my own experiences with the spectral children. Surprisingly, many opened up about their own encounters, which they had often kept to themselves for fear of disbelief. The vicar, Father O'Hara, became a particularly close confidant during this time. One evening, as we walked through the graveyard where many of the children were buried, he discussed the ritual aspect of the commemoration. "We believe it's not just about remembering," he said, gesturing to the well-tended graves, each marked with a small, white cross. "It's also about helping these young spirits find their way. Maybe this year, with you here, we might finally help them move on." "What exactly happens during the ceremony?" I asked, curious how such an event could potentially aid in releasing the haunted spirits. "It's a mixture of prayer, song, and reflection," he explained. "At the climax, we light a bonfire, representing the light guiding them home. This year, we thought to add something new, a moment of silence, just before the lighting, where we will invite anyone to speak to the spirits, to offer them words of love and release." The idea struck a deep chord within me. Perhaps this could be the moment to bridge the gap between the living and the dead, to give the children the understanding and peace they so desperately craved. As the day of the commemoration drew near, the village buzzed with a nervous energy. I helped set up chairs in the square and watched as children very much alive rehearsed a song they would sing during the ceremony. Their innocent voices brought a bittersweet feeling, a stark contrast to the silent, ghostly children I had come to know. That night, as I lay in bed, the wind whispered through the cracks in the cottage, carrying with it the faint sound of children laughing. But this time, the laughter didn't feel mocking or chilling. Instead, it seemed expectant, as if the children were awaiting what was to come with as much hope as I felt. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and bright. The village square filled with residents and a few visitors, all gathered to pay their respects. As the ceremony began, the air filled with songs and prayers, the community's voices united in a powerful expression of collective memory and hope. When the moment of silence came, I stepped forward. My heart pounded as I faced the crowd, then the bonfire, ready to be lit. I spoke not just to the village but to the children themselves, my words an offering of peace and understanding. Tonight, we remember those lost, those young spirits who have lingered in pain and confusion. We acknowledge your suffering, and we offer you our love and our memory to light your way home. May you find peace, may you know that you are not forgotten, and may this light guide you to rest. The silence that followed was profound, the air thick with emotion. Then, with a collective breath, the bonfire was lit, flames reaching towards the sky, crackling with the promise of release and renewal. As the fire burned, I felt a shift in the air, a lightness that seemed to spread through the crowd and into the night. Whether it was enough to help the children find their peace, I couldn't be sure. But as the flames danced and the community stood together, I felt hope that we had done something important, something that might just mend the fabric of the village and give its oldest, most silent inhabitants the release they deserved. The night after the ceremony, the village slept under a blanket of quiet unlike any it had experienced in years. The bonfire had burned long into the night, its embers glowing softly in the early morning light, a symbolic beacon for lost souls seeking the path to peace. As dawn broke, the world seemed to awaken with a gentle sigh, as if relieved of a long-carried burden. I awoke feeling a profound sense of calm, the restless spirits of the children no longer whispering in the winds. For the first time since arriving in the village, the air felt lighter, the haunting presence that had pervaded the woods and the fields felt cleansed. As I walked through the village, the change was palpable. Neighbors greeted each other with smiles, a shared sense of relief and hope echoing in their voices. At the cafe, Mrs. Elwood noticed the change in me immediately. "You look like you've found what you were looking for," she remarked as she poured me a cup of coffee. "I think we all have," I replied, glancing out the window where the first leaves of fall were turning golden in the light. "Last night felt like a turning point." "It was," she agreed, nodding. "There's been a sadness over this village for too long. Maybe now we can start to heal." Curious about the effects of the ceremony, I visited the church where Father O'Hara was tidying up from the previous night's events. He looked up as I entered, a knowing smile spreading across his face. "You've done something very special, you know," he said as he approached, his voice filled with gratitude. "I think last night, we all felt it, something lifted. The children, if they were with us, I believe they found their way." Encouraged by his words, I spent the day wandering through the village and the surrounding woods, the places where I had first felt the eerie chill of the children's presence. Now, as I walked through the same paths, the usual sounds of the forest returned, unmarred by the whispers and giggles of unseen spirits. Feeling a chapter of my life closing as peacefully as the sun set, I decided it was time to finish what I had come here to do. My novel, inspired by the events I had witnessed and the stories I had become a part of, flowed from my fingers like a river finally released from a dam. The words told not just my story, but also the story of the village, of the children, and of a community's healing. Weeks later, as I packed my belongings into my car, ready to leave the village behind, I felt a mix of sadness and relief. The cottage had become more than just a retreat, it had been a place of discovery, of ghostly encounters turned into healing. I took one last walk through the village, stopping by the cafe to say goodbye to Mrs. Elwood. "You're always welcome here, you know," she said as she hugged me goodbye. "You've helped us more than you can know." "Thank you," I replied, feeling the truth of her words deep within me. "This place will always be a part of me."